Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and in today's video, I'm talking about some past NBA free agency signings that were crazy at the time for whatever reason, whether they turned out really positively or really negatively, most of them very negatively, that you probably forgot about because there's been a lot of high-profile, big-name players that have gotten big free agency contracts. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of those more under-the-radar signings that you guys probably forgot about. But really quickly, before we get started, if you enjoy the NBA, then consider subscribing. I upload basically every single day. Okay, first up is actually two entries, and it's Ben Gordon and Charlie Villenueva signing with the Detroit Pistons in 2009. Gordon for 5 years, $55 million, and Villenueva for 5 years, $35 million. And this was a roster that was attempting a little bit of a rebuild after they had all that success in the mid-2000s. Some of the players on those teams were beginning to leave. Ben Wallace had left a few years earlier, then Chauncey Billups had left as well via a trade, and they still had Rip Hamilton, they still had Tayshaun Prince, but they were trying to start a new era of Pistons basketball. And so they had Rip Hamilton and Tayshaun Prince, but they also had Will Bynum and Rodney Stuckey, and then they brought in Ben Gordon and Charlie Villenueva to add some scoring punch. Gordon being a smaller two-guard, but someone that could really shoot the basketball, and Villenueva being a kind of ahead of his time player as a little bit of an inside-out big man. The problem was they never really found the team success that they were hoping for, never won more than 30 games in the entire 5-year stretch that these contracts would run, and Villenueva would be there for the entire 5-year deal, but Gordon would be traded just a couple of years after spending time in Detroit. And it wasn't necessarily a bad idea, right, to try and bring in this talent. It just didn't work. They just didn't have enough talent there in Detroit. These guys struggled to stay healthy, and for Villenueva, at least, probably arguably just wasn't as good as the Pistons thought that he would be when they brought him in. So this is big money back in 2009 being given to two players in the same offseason, and they really didn't get too much out of it, at least in terms of team success. Moving on now to a more recent one. Back in the summer of 2015, and we all know the story about the summer of 2015 and 16, all this big money being spent on free agents as the cap was rising steadily in 15, and then the big jump in 16 that allowed Kevin Durant to go to the Warriors. This one in 2015, Brandon Knight being signed to the Phoenix Suns for 5 years and $70 million. This was technically a re-signing because he was traded to the Suns from Milwaukee mid-season during the prior year. And initially, it actually looked like a pretty good signing. In his first season under this new contract, although he did have some injury issues, he averaged nearly 20 points per game. He was still young at this point. I believe he was 23 or 24 years old, a dynamic kind of combo guard that could attack the rim, really good athlete. He needed to improve as a perimeter shooter, but was clearly athletically good enough to be a really good NBA guard, and like I said, could get to the rim, get in the paint, and play make. The problem was he could just never stay healthy, and he wasn't on the Suns for very long. He was traded to the Rockets in 2018, was basically just a salary dump, and it was really just because he couldn't stay on the floor. He had a couple of major injuries and then a couple of nagging injuries as well, and even to this point, just never was able to find his rhythm, his groove again in the NBA after all of those injuries, took away from him some of the athleticism that made him such a dynamic player initially. And he was traded around to a couple of different teams, so this probably wasn't the most prudent idea for the Suns to sign him to such a big deal. But talent-wise, it wasn't a completely crazy idea. It just didn't work out for them long term. And looking back on it now, considering the production they got out of him compared to the amount of money he was paid, it obviously wasn't worth it. Moving on now, let's go back a little bit further. I talked about the Detroit Pistons in the first entry, and we're going to be talking about them a little bit again in this one. And it's Ben Wallace signing with the Chicago Bulls in 2006. And there's a couple of different reports in terms of the money value. I saw 4 years, $52 million. I also saw 4 years, $60 million. Whatever it was, the Bulls were signing a 32-year-old Ben Wallace, a guy that had been a defensive player of the year a couple of times in Detroit, one of the best defensive players in the league, and was a key part of the Detroit Pistons team having success in the mid-2000s, but also winning a championship. But looking back on it now, this would never happen in 2020. It just wouldn't. He's 32 years old, an undersized player, relied a lot on athleticism, among other things, to be a really good defensive player, and there was just no way you were going to get this level of value for 4 more years out of Ben Wallace. And he had an okay first season and then was gone just a year later as he was shipped to the Cavaliers, and it was just a thing where he was past his prime, and he wasn't Ben Wallace anymore, really, and it just never worked out in Chicago. It never really should have been a thing in the first place at that money value for that long period of time, and he was never a big stats guy outside of, the blocks and steals numbers. So when you look back on it historically, it probably looks even worse than it was even in that first season. But it was never a good idea to give a 32-year-old big man like that much money at the time for Chicago. Moving on now to one that actually really interested me when I was looking through this and looking up possibilities for this list, and it's 2009 again. But this time it's Hedo Turkoglu going to the Toronto Raptors in what was technically a sign-and trade for 5 years, $53 million. It was one of those things where you read about it and you're like, oh yeah, I kind of remember, how all this went down, because initially Turkoglu looked like he was going to end up in Portland, and then out of nowhere at the end, the Raptors kind of stole him away because they offered a bit more money. And Turkoglu benefited probably more than any other player in this free agency class from his performance that regular season, but also in the postseason. He was a very solid player for Orlando in prior years, but he was a huge part of their run to the NBA Finals that year, and they made it relatively clear that it was going to be tough to bring him back the following year. And he had such a unique blend of size and skill as a playmaker and as a shooter and a scorer that he was in pretty high demand and one of the most sought-after free agents of that entire class. So at the time, 5 years, 53, even though he was 29, 30 years old, wasn't crazy, but he never really found the kind of success in Toronto that he had in that postseason run with the Magic. Only lasted like 74 games with the team and then ended up moving on to Phoenix, and his career was never really the same. And it was disappointing because Turkoglu was one of the most fun players to watch during that finals run because of his unique blend of size and skill that you just didn't really see all that often in that era, or really in any era. And he is someone that, kind of like Charlie Villenueva, I'd like to see what they would have been like in 2020, because I feel like maybe the utilization of them was what caused their careers to go downhill later on. Because you got to remember, Turkoglu was playing in that system in Orlando that is very much like, maybe 2015-16 style of NBA basketball with one roll man and a ton of shooters. And it would have been nice to see him continue to be in that kind of environment for the rest of his career, but for whatever reason, just wasn't able to figure it out at any stops past Orlando. Okay, so not all these are negative, and so this is the one wildly positive entry. It's actually 3 entries with the same team in the same offseason. In 2013, the Atlanta Hawks signed Paul Millsap, 2 years, $19 million, DeMarre Carroll, 2 years, $5 million, and Kyle Korver, 4 years, $24 million. And those were 3 key members of a 60-win team just a year later. They had a solid season. The first year after this offseason made the playoffs, but the next year they won 60 games. They were the 1 seed in the Eastern Conference. And 2 of the guys that they signed to relatively modest salaries, Millsap and Korver, became all-stars in 2015, and then Carroll was an important player of that group as well. When you've got Al Horford, Paul Millsap, DeMarre Carroll, Kyle Korver, and Jeff Teague. And it's just kind of incredible that looking back, all of those guys were signed within the same offseason. I mean, DeMarre Carroll got a huge deal afterwards. Millsap was re-signed at a nice dollar amount for him. And it's just kind of crazy to look back and be like, really, Paul Millsap only got 2 years, 19? I understand that he wasn't, the same kind of player initially that he would become in Atlanta when he came to them in the first place. But I remember that being one that everybody was like, wait, how did he only get this much money? And it ended up working out for him because he made the right move. He said, okay, I'm going to be here for 2 years. I'm going to do really well, and I'm going to capitalize on that when I become a free agent. And then Korver, everybody knew, was one of the better shooters in the league, but became something entirely different with Coach Mike Budenholzer's system there in Atlanta. And this is honestly, if you're just looking at strictly value for the money you're spending, one of the best free agency, signing groups for one individual team in league history. I mean, of course, you've got, super teams being created and you're signing LeBron. There's a ton of value there. But if you're just talking about smaller, dollar amounts and the amount of value you're getting in return, I don't really see how you do much better than 3 really key guys on a 60-win team and 2 all-stars just a year after you sign them. So this was honestly one that I didn't even realize they signed all these guys in the same offseason, and a really fantastic and incredible job by the Hawks front office to bring in all those guys at that number. And last up now, we go back to 2006. Jeffries, 5 years, $30 million signing with the New York Knicks. It was unlikely that we were going to do this entire video without mentioning the Knicks. There's Jerome James, there's Joakim Noah, but I wanted to go to one that I felt like was the most obscure. and it is Jared Jeffries. And it was just such a weird situation even looking back on it. This is a guy that spent his first couple years in Washington, became a free agent, was known as a good defender, but not, anybody that's really going to score the ball all that well. And for whatever reason, the Knicks were just like, hey, we're in love with this guy, we want to bring him in. 5 years, $30 million back in 2006 is way too much money to be spending on a guy that for his first 3 years as a Knick, he had a later stint with them, but in this contract that he signed with the team averaged like 4.5 points per game. And I understand the value of defense, and it's not all about the box score and stuff like that, but there's quotes from Isaiah Thomas, the general manager at the time, that they brought him in because he brings chemistry to the team. 5 years, $30 million for a chemistry player doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Certainly not a very valuable free agency signing at all, and someone that if you went in a time machine, you went back and you asked all of these GMs, what's your interest level in Jared Jeffries? They are not going to be remotely close, I would bet, to 5 years, $30 million. The Knicks, for some reason, were enamored with him. They brought him in, and this is the last kind of crazy free agency signing that I'd be willing to bet a lot of you guys forgot about back in 2006. And yeah, there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.